In today's tutorial, we're going to look at the document setups for your book cover artwork, and then we'll look at the process to bringing your cover art, once it's completed, into the mock-up that we have showing here. So the assignment itself calls for a 1-inch spine on a 6x9 cover. So we need to make our document setups accordingly so that you can work from this point of view. We talked about this in our previous lecture, and this is a book cover that's been laid out. It's not yet applied to the mock-up. However, it has a few things showing here that we need to be aware of. First is it's a 6x9 cover, so within these guides here where we have a 6x9 space front and back and 1-inch spine. However, you're going to see around the edges there's a 0.125 or 1/8 of an inch bleed. We have to include our bleed in the document setup for Photoshop because it's canvas based, it's not a page. We'll see in Illustrator how that differs. And then what we do from Photoshop, from our Photoshop file, if that's where the base of your book cover is, your artwork, we'll look at how we can bring that over into this mock-up file here. So the first thing we're going to do, we'll set up our Illustrator document. Now, when you're working on a book cover like this, or really any project, even if the bulk of it is going to be worked on in Photoshop, much of the artwork may be done prior in Illustrator. So for example, in this one, I have this all based in Photoshop. You can see the files here, and it shows where aspects of the book were brought in and or developed in Photoshop. However, this particular book was designed in the layout, the content layout of the cover was designed in Illustrator. Now the reason for that was because there was a fair bit of type. It didn't require going into InDesign, but the nature of the type and how I wanted to work with it made Illustrator the easier choice. Illustrator is simply easier to manipulate type in than Photoshop, and of course we have the vector aspect to it and so on. So the graphics that you're seeing here, actually, the content, was all done in Illustrator, and it was copy and pasted or placed in to this Photoshop file. Now the reason that it wasn't all done in Illustrator was because this particular cover has, zoom in here for us, this has a texture. Now we talked a bit about how textures and book cover design work together in terms of the texture acting like somewhat of a paper or a background, just to bring some tactile feel to it. Now this cover has been modified a bit, but in the original version, the texture goes actually behind this object to stand the object off a little. Yet, the content had to be brought in to Photoshop in order to do what's called a multiply, or use the layer modes in order to make it appear as though the texture is coming through the text a little bit. It's a very minor and almost not noticeable aspect of the cover. However, in a very good print process, when this is printed well, these things can be noticed. But really we do this in order to set the graphic into the page, to really make it look like, although it's obvious that it wasn't printed on a textured paper or anything, you just don't want it to be entirely apparent that it's just text on top of the texture. So we try to do these little things, although they're very subtle. Those details do help when the final print is done. So this one was, again, laid out in Illustrator, and then the components brought into Photoshop. The object on the page was done in Photoshop, and of course the texture was as well. So we have the background, which is just a white, and then the texture is placed on top, and you can see a few things going on in here. This background was worked in Photoshop a few ways, so there's some differences that we see in here happening, but when it's all together and it's all printed, those things aren't necessarily noticeable, of course. They're part of correctly developing the art. Okay, so in the project for yourselves, you will at some point, of course, be bringing it into Photoshop, and that's in your mock-up. The encouragement is to design it in Photoshop, and by design, I should say, ultimately lay it out in Photoshop. You can do, of course, like I said, your layout work in Illustrator. You can even use InDesign if you're comfortable with that. The components should come into Photoshop, and we'll see how that works in terms of using the mock-up. And I'll explain a couple of things that you can work towards when you're designing it so that you know that it's going to fit the mock-up correctly. So let's first do a document setup in Illustrator. So we'll go create new. Now we have to consider some math here. I'll actually go back for a moment just as a reminder. Remember, we're working with a 6x9 cover. So our cover space, our 6x9 is here. So we call it a 6x9 based on its size when it's closed. So that's the front cover 6x9. And of course, the back cover is also 6x9. Then we have the 1-inch spine. And we talked about the fact that on the Photoshop document, we have a 1/8 of an inch bleed going all the way around. So in our Illustrator document, we're going to set up, making sure we're using inches. We're going to set up a 13x9. So I'm going to explain where that math comes from. The 13x9, remember, we're doing an open cover. So we're designing our cover looking like this. The 13 comes from 6 on the back cover, plus 1 on the spine, and 6 on the front cover. So 6 plus 1 is 7 plus 6 is 13. Or even easier, 6 and 6 is 12, and the 1-inch spine is 13. However, in Illustrator, we don't need to include the bleed in our document size because we add bleed down here. In Illustrator and InDesign, we know that the bleed is external of our page, of our content. So we have a 13x9. The orientation is landscape, and I have one artboard here. You can do as many artboards as you feel you need if you're designing and doing mock-ups, absolutely. Sometimes when I design book covers, I'll have a dozen artboards because I keep modifying as I go, changing and altering my design as I work through it. We're going to turn our bleed to 0.125. So again, that's just one click of one of the buttons here, one of the up arrows, as long as you have your link selected. So you simply want to make sure that 0.125 is in each field for your bleed. So 13x9 landscape orientation with a 0.125 inch, which is 1/8 of an inch bleed. And we'll choose create. So we have our basic document here. However, that's not very easy to design on when you know you have to be very specific in terms of the location of your content. When you're working on a book cover, things do have to be specific. You have to be careful that you're not going too close to the edges. You have to be very aware of where your spine is, remembering, of course, that the front cover will be on the right, the back cover on the back, or on the left. So we're going to bring out some guides here. Now the guides in Illustrator there's actually a very easy way to do them in Photoshop. In Illustrator, they're easy to bring out guides, of course. However, Illustrator is a little more of a free program, so the pre-setting of the guides is sometimes not there. We have different ways that we can do it. We can turn objects into guides and so on. However, I'm just going to give you the simplest way to move your guides around. And it takes a little bit of math, and I'll show you. It's very basic, but I'll show you where the math comes from again. So first thing, we want to make sure our rulers are on. Here my rulers aren't showing. So I'm going to go to View. I can do Command R, or I can go to Show Rulers, and I always do Command R, so I'm probably going to take a moment to find my Show Rulers here. And I can't even see them. So I'm just going to do Command R. That's what I always do. So Command R, the rulers are on, and I'm sure in the view menu it's there somewhere, but it eludes me right now. And you can, to use guides, you can of course click on the ruler and drag out a guide. Or we can make an object a guide. So if I wanted, for example, this square to be a guide, I can right click on it and make a guide. We don't need to be that complicated. Right now, all I need to do, I'm going to slide out one guide. I'm going to put it here. Now, I could, of course, go by the rulers, the measurements. Typically, that's what I would do. I pull a guide out and I go right to 6. And in this case, that's probably fine. I can see it's at 6, pretty accurate. If it's off by a very slight amount, that's not too big of a problem. However, when again it comes to designing book covers, we do want to be accurate. So if you from the get-go want to make sure you're accurate, we need to first make sure our guides are unlocked, because we're going to do a little bit of manipulation with them. So we'll go to View and down to Guides and Unlock Guides. I keep still looking for that Show Rulers. Okay, so our guides are unlocked, which means with our main selection cursor, we can select the guides. We can select and move them. Now you're going to see that it's at 6. I can click on it, however, and I think, okay, it's at 6. Well, it's probably not exactly at 6. So with it selected, I'm going up into my object panel here. Remember, you'll want to be working on Essentials Classic. That's the easiest one to be working on. And when you select that, if we go up here, we see the X and the Y axis. So if you're unsure what the X and Y axis is, X is referring to the line that goes across, the horizontal or the horizon line. And Y is up and down. And a good way to remember that is X is like across. The letter X is across. So across the page is the X-axis. The letter Y sort of merges like a funnel and points down. And the up and down, the vertical, is the Y-axis. So what we want to do is make sure that this guide that I have selected is located at exactly 6 inches on the X-axis. So if we look up here, it says 5.9932. Now, that's pretty exact, but it's not exactly 6. So I'm going to double click there and I'll do 6. And then I'm going to make another one so I can actually copy it. Again, I'm doing Option, Shift, click and drag. Or I can just pull another one out from here. And I'll put it at about 7, because this is indicating our 1-inch spine. So now again, we can see it's not exactly at 7. It's at 6.998. So I'm going to make sure that's at 7 inches. Now the reason that's at 7 is because we want to be 6 inches for our back cover away from the edge. So that's our 6-inch back cover. We want a 1-inch spine. So 6 plus 1 is 7, and that's why this second guide landed at 7. Now because we don't have any bleed happening on here, we don't need any other guides. We don't need any guides up and down because we, again, don't have bleed, and we, of course, don't have a spine that travels that way. So what we're really making sure of here is that we have our spine defined. We know exactly where our spine is when we're designing our book cover. If we're laying any content out in Illustrator that we may or may not be bringing over into Photoshop. Now, if you wanted another guide, maybe for a margin to keep yourself away from that edge, same thing would occur. You would, let's say we want to keep ourselves a 1/2 inch away from the edge with any content. Bring that out. Again, on our x-axis, we'll do 0.5 for 1/2 inch. And then I can copy this, Option Shift, click and drag. I'll go down here. So we know that a 1/2 inch away from 13 will be 12.5. So I'll just correct that to be exact. And I realize that this can be a little annoying when you're being perfectly exact with your guide locations. However, it is the best, definitely the best way to work, especially when you're working on something that's going into a very precise production process, such as a book, where it has to be printed, bound, folded. There's glue involved, there's heat involved, so the more accurate you are as the designer, the less it can come back on you if anything goes wrong. If there are any problems with the production and print process, of course, they want to make sure that the file was set correctly first. So now, even if I want to do a 1/2 inch from the top and bottom, I'll bring a guide out from the top. So we want a 1/2 inch from the top. So that's going to be on the X or the Y-axis, 0.5. And then, of course, a 1/2 inch from 9, because our height is 9, will be 8.5. So Option, click and drag. And I'll just make sure that's exactly at 8.5. Okay, so again, you don't have to do your margins. It's often a good idea, of course, and even I'd be wise if I'm going to do that to bring them a 1/2 inch from my spine as well, because we know that being 1/2 inch away from the edge is fine, but our content on the cover, a spine, when a book is closed, the spine is actually an edge in and of itself, right? So we would bring a 1/2 inch away from that too. So it gets a little complicated when you see all these guides, but they do certainly have a purpose. So I would recommend definitely having at least your spine guides, of course, and then it's often advisable just to know how far away from the edge you are. But that's up to you. That's a judgment call, and it's based on how you'd like to work. Now, what you definitely want to do is make sure you lock those guides again, because once you start working on here, it's easy to accidentally select a guide, move it, or delete it. So going up to View and Guides and Lock Guides will make sure that these can't be selected and they can't be moved. Okay, so that's our Illustrator document, and make sure you save that. So now I'm going to go to Photoshop, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do your document setup for Photoshop. Now, this one is a little different again because Photoshop has a canvas, and we don't add bleed, we include bleed in our canvas. And remember, anytime we're working on something with print, we're adding that bleed. The bleed is what exceeds the content that exceeds your page edge and would get clipped away in a production process. So in this case, that changes our document size a bit. I'm going to go to my canvas size here, or we can go in image size, but I'll go canvas. So remember, we were doing in Illustrator a 13 by 9. That's because the 1/8 of an inch bleed on each side, left, right, top, and bottom, was added after. Here we have to include it. So we're going to do our document size at 13. So that's 6 plus 1 plus 6, 13.25. Because 1/8 of bleed over here and 1/8 of an inch bleed over here equals 1/4 of an inch, or 0.125. And we did the same for we'll do the same for the height, 9.25. Again, this is a 13 by 9 with the bleed included. So we'll do new document. And in the width, we're going to do 13.25, 9.25, and I'll leave my background contents as white. Say OK. Okay, so now again, without guides, this becomes quite useless. So we definitely need to get our guides in here. And this time we have to include guides that will indicate to us where our page edge is, so that we're not taking any important content out into the bleed. So making sure our rulers are on. If your rulers are not on, you can go to View and you'll go to Show Guides. And of course, again, when I do this, there we go, they were on. When I do this, because I do so much with the key commands, I often have trouble now finding these basic things in the menus. However, you want to make sure that you're showing guides, and there they are right there in the show menu. And making sure, your rulers as well, show rulers. That's what I initially went to go to. So again, I don't see that here. I have to look for that. I don't know why I always miss that. Don't know. I always miss it because I always, for 25 years, have done Command R. So if your rulers aren't showing, Command R, or if you're on a PC, Control R is the best way to bring them up. Okay, so I'm going to pull out a guide here because that's how we can again do it. You could go to 6, but now we have to consider the math that's going on because our document includes our bleed. So I'm going to put this back and I'm going to do it a little differently. I'm going to go down and I'm going to choose New Guide. So this is where we can actually be very specific and we can place a guide at the exact number we want. So we have to think about some of this math for a moment. So I'm going to choose New Guide. Now I want a guide that's going to indicate my bleed and my spine in all instances of sides. So the bleed for each side and of course the spine. So I want to do a vertical guide. So vertical, it's going to run up and down, and it's giving me the option for the position where I want it. So I first want it 0.125, which is the amount of our bleed from that left edge. So 0.125, and I'll say OK. And there it puts my guide that this is indicating my page edge and also showing where the bleed is. Now I need that first spine guide. Well, you may think, okay, well that's at 6 inches. Well, it's actually going to be at 6.125 because we have bleed here. So our cover, once this bleed gets trimmed away, our cover has to be 6 inches wide. So we'll go to View, New Guide, and this time we'll do 6.125. And then +1 inch for the spine. So our next guide will be 7.125. And of course, now we're way down here. So we need a guide that is 0.125 plus 6 plus 7, so we're at 7.125. So 7.125 plus 6 is 13.125. So a new guide again. 13.125. Now I know that math, as simple as it may seem to some, it can certainly seem a little daunting to others. I absolutely understand that. So again, where I'm getting my math from is from the page edge. We need to define with the guides where our page edge, sorry, I should have said from the canvas edge, because we need to define where our cover's page edge is and where the spine is. So either way, you're really trying to make sure that you're aware of your space. So it's 0.125 bleed, that's our standard bleed. Our page size is 6, so 0.125 plus 6, that's where we got our first guide. We know our spine is 1 inch, so 6.125 plus 1 is 7.125. And then 7.125 plus 6, that jump to our right side edge, is 13.125. And there we have our bleed defined. So it definitely can be a little confusing, especially if you just, you're not too big into math, but also if you're not used to inches and fractions and so on. So now we're going to bring down a guide from the top. We can, of course, click and drag to bring it down, and you'll see it shows us in that indicator that it's landing at 0.125, if I can get it, but sometimes you can't. I'm a stickler for precision when it comes to this kind of work, like I said, because of the production process. So I'm just going to go to View, and again, do a new guide. This time I'm doing a horizontal guide because it's running left to right along the horizon. So here I'll put 0.125. And then of course, way down here, we're going to do it 9.125. Okay, so let's look at the difference between these two documents. Our Illustrator document, where you may be doing layout work, you may be doing a word mark, a title for your logo, and so on. It's where you can do the layout, do some practice, whatever you want. It is a little different because the page is here. The bleed guide is something we add in the settings. Remember, we did the page as a 13 by 9, 6-inch cover, 1-inch spine, 6-inch cover again. So 13 by 9, and we put in the settings that 0.125 bleed. Now, in Photoshop, we did the same document setup, a 13 by 9, but we included the bleed that added 1/4 of an inch to each dimension. Therefore, our document setup in Photoshop ended up being 13.25 by 9.25. And you may see this. I don't always understand why it does this. Even though I entered 13.25, sometimes Photoshop will add that little bit on. That's nothing to worry about. And you can often just reset it. You can set it back and it won't complain, but it might add it again. So we'll see if it did here. Yeah, see, so it may have something to do with the resolution of the screen, and it could be any number of things, but it's not to worry about when you have that little bit. Okay, so those are our document setups. Next, we're going to look at moving your artwork from Photoshop into the mock-up.